Hello everyone. In the last session, we have discussed the female part of the flower called the gynoecium, the parts of the gynoecium, the structure of the anatropous ovule, structure of the embryo sac, the two important processes called the megasporogenesis and megagametogenesis. In addition, we have also discussed about the what is the pollination and an outline classification of the pollination. Well, in today's session, we will discuss about the pollination. So, what is a pollination? Pollination means it is a transfer of the pollen grain from where to where, from anther to stigma of the same flower or different flowers on the same plant is called pollination. So, pollination is the process of transfer of the pollen grain from anther to stigma of the same flower or different flowers on the same plant is called pollination. The pollination is always said to be the first step leading to the development of ovary into fruit and ovule into the seed. Then what about the second step here? The second step is always said to be the fertilization. So the pollination is always said to be the first step and fertilization is always said to be the second step in the process of sexual reproduction in the flowering plants. Now we will discuss about the classification in the pollinations. As we know that the pollination is involving two different categories here, self-pollination and cross-pollination. The self-pollination is again categorized into autogamy and heterogamy. Under autogamy, we have two conditions. They are referred as clecitogamy and chasmogamy. On the other hand, the cross-pollination has only one category, it is the hologamy. Now, let us study the self-pollination and its type here. What is a self-pollination? The self-pollination is the transfer of the pollen grain from anther to stigma of the same flower or the same flower is called self-pollination. The self-pollination can also be referred as autogamy. Under self-pollination, we have two divisions here, homogamy and heterogamy. So what is a homogamy? In the bisexual flowers, the pollen is deposited on the stigma of the same flower. This is what we call homogamy. Then what is the heterogamy? Here the transfer of the pollen grain of one flower to stigma of the another flower on the same plant is called heterogamy. Under homogamy, there are two conditions. We refer them as clecitogamy and chasmogamy. So what is a clecitogamy and what is a chasmogamy? If you look in the clecitogamy, the pollination will have occurs in the closed flower. So it is a condition in which the flowers are bisexual and the pollination takes place in the closed flower. Then what is chasmogamy? Chasmogamy is a condition in which the flower is open and sex organs are exposed. So in chasmogamy, the pure autogamy is not possible. So what is clecitogamy? Clecitogamy is the condition in which the flowers are bisexual and the pollination takes place in the closed flower. So what is the chasmogamy? Chasmogamy is a condition where the pollination takes place in the opened flower. So in the chasmogamy, the pure autogamy is not possible here. Therefore, the self-pollination, it does not produce any genetic variation in the offspring. The offspring will be same as that of the parent, and the offspring does not evolve further, and the offspring does not show adaptation to new environment. So now we'll discuss about the cross-pollination here. So what is a cross-pollination? It is the transfer of the pollen grain from anther of one flower to stigma of the another flower is called cross-pollination. The cross-pollination can also be called as hologamy. In the cross-pollination, we have a type. The type is called xenogamy. It is called xenogamy. So what is a xenogamy? Xenogamy means it is the transfer of the pollen grain from anther of one flower to the stigma of the another flower of different plant but of same species is called xenogamy. So xenogamy andre ಏನು? Xenogamy means it is a transfer of the pollen grain from anther of one flower to the stigma of the another flower of different plant but of the same species is called xenogamy. Therefore, the cross-pollination, it always produces a genetically different offspring. So now, let's study the advantage of the cross-pollination over the self-pollination. If you look at the advantage of cross-pollination over self-pollination, there are a number of advantages. Since cross-pollination brings genetic variation in the offspring, it leads to the origin of new species and its evolution. The offspring will have an high adaptability towards the changing environment, and the plant produced are usually larger and offspring will have a better character. So if you summarize the advantage of cross-pollination over the self-pollination, the cross-pollination brings genetic variation in the offspring. It leads to the origin of new species and its evolution. The offspring will have an rich adaptability towards the changing environment. The plant produced are usually larger and the offspring produced will have a better character. So, in nature, the plants always shows certain adaptations, which we can also refer them as contrivances to carry out the cross-pollination and to prevent the self-pollination. So naturally the plants they show adaptation to carry out the cross-pollination and to prevent the self-pollinations. This is called as outbreeding device. So now let's study about the outbreeding devices. So what is a outbreeding device? The outbreeding device is a device that always favors the cross pollination and they always neglect the self pollinations. The first device is referred as diclini. Number 2 referred as dichogamy. Number 3 they referred as self sterility. Number 4 it is referred as heterostyle. Number 5 they referred as ergogamy. So there are around 5 different outbreeding devices: diclini, dichogamy, self-sterility, heterostyle, and ergogamy. Now we will study the outbreeding devices in detail. As I told earlier, there are 5 different devices. Okay, so let's discuss each and every device in detail. When we look in the first one called the diclini. Diclini tagondaga. Okay, the best example we find is the cucumber flower. The other example is the papaya flower. Here, the flowers are usually unisexual in nature. Unisexual means they have either carpel or the stamen. Such flowers are said to be diclini. Such diclinous flower always encourages the cross pollination. So what is a diclini? Diclini means when the flowers are unisexual, that means when they have either carpel or stamen, they are said to be diclini. Such diclinous flower, they always encourages the cross pollination. The best example is the cucumber flower and the papaya flower. Number 2, it is called dichogamy. In bisexual flowers, the stamen and carpels they mature at different times. There are 2 kinds of dichogamy. Number 1, protandrous, protandrous, protandrous. Number 2, protogyny, protogyny, protogyny. So I'll repeat once again. There are 2 kinds of the dichogamy, protandrous and protogyny. So what is a protandrous? Here the stamens matures first and the condition is said to be protandrous. If the carpel matures first, the condition is said to be protogyny. Okay, so protandrous means it is a condition where the stamens mature first, and it is more common. The best example is the marigold. The other example is the sunflower. And if you look at the protogyny, here the carpel, which is the female part of the flower, they mature first. The best example is the custard apple flower. The other example is mirabilis flower, and the other example is the ficus flower here. So, in the dichogamy, it is noticed in the bisexual flowers where the stamens and carpels they mature at different types. There are two kinds of dichogamy. Number one, protandrous. Number two, protogynic. So what is the protandrous? The protandrous means here the stamens mature first. The best example is the marigold. The other example is sunflower and hibiscus. So what is a protogyny? Protogyny means it is a condition where the carpel means it is a female part of the flower. Okay, the carpel matures first. Example is the custard apple, the flower. The other example is mirabilis flower and ficus flower here. Now let us study the next device, which we call them as self-sterility and heterostyle. If you look the self-sterility, this is a genetic mechanism where the pollen of a plant cannot fertilize the ovule of the same plant. So what is the self-sterility? It is a device where there is some genetic mechanism where the pollen of a plant cannot fertilize the ovule of the same plant. It is noticed in certain species of passiflora flower. Okay, the self-sterility they are noticed in some of the species of passiflora flower. Fine. The next one, it is called as heterostyle. Here, when the plant bears the flower with a different length of the style, it is said to be heterostyle. If you look here, in the heterostyle, the plant bearing flowers will have different length of the style, and this is said to be heterostyle. The best example is the jasmine flower, and the other example is oxalis flower here. So now we'll study the next device. It is called as ergogamy. In some of the plants where the flower will have some physical barriers between the components of anther and stigma, this condition is said to be ergogamy. So what is ergogamy? In some of the plants, the flowers will have physical barriers that between the components of anther and stigma. This condition is called ergogamy. Ergogamy always it prevents self-pollination. The best example is the calotropis. In the calotropis, the pollen grains are enclosed in a petaloid structure called pollinia. So, in the calotropis, the pollen grains are enclosed in a petaloid structure called pollinia. If this pollinia falls on the female part of the same flower, it does not germinate. The other example is in a flower of orchids. They have a thick surface on the stigma. This thick surface it prevents the self-pollination. Therefore, this peculiar arrangement found in some of the flowers like the calotropis and orchid, they act as a barrier to prevent the self-pollination. So now we will discuss the next important concept regarding agents involved in the pollination. There are three agents which brings the act of pollination. The first agent is called the wind. Second, the water. And number 3, the animals. If the wind brings the pollination, it is said to be anemophily. If the water brings the pollination, it is said to be hydrophily. If the animal, if they bring the pollination, they are said to be zoophily. So what is anemophily? When wind acts as the agent in bringing the pollination, it is said to be anemophily. So what is hydrophily? If the water acts as the agent that brings the pollination in the aquatic plants, it is said to be hydrophily. If the animals, if they bring the act of pollination, it is said to be the zoophily. Now, now we'll study the nature of the flower, which always favors the wind for the pollination. So the first categories of flower, they are referred as anemophilous flower. If the wind brings the pollination in the flowers, such flowers are said to be anemophilous flower. So how does these anemophilous flower look like? What do they have? These anemophilous flower, they are very small, they are unisexual. And number 3, they have an exposed sex organs in the flower. So anther and the androecium and the gynoecium are always exposed. If you take the stigma of the gynoecium, they are feathery in nature, and the anther always produces the pollen grain, which is of dry, light and non-sticky in nature. So how does the anemophilous flower look like? The anemophilous flowers, they are small, they are unisexual, they have exposed sex organs like the androecium and gynoecium are freely exposed, and the stigma will have feathery stigma, and the pollen grains are dry, light and non-sticky in nature. So now let's discuss about the nature of the hydrophilous flower. How does hydrophilous flower look like? The hydrophilous flower, they're always small, they're colorless, they're odorless, and the pollen grains produced, they're unwettable, and even the stigma also remains unwettable. And these pollen grains, they're long and needle-like to bring the pollination at a faster rate. So how does hydrophilous flower look like? They're small, they're colorless, odorless, unwettable pollen grains and stigma, and they have needle-like pollen grains. Now we'll study the nature of the zoophilous flower. So how does a zoophilous flower look like? What is the nature of the zoophilous flower? The zoophilous flower, they are larger in structure, they have a larger shape, and they have highly colored petals, and they're highly fragmented, and they're nectared in nature. So the zoophilous flowers are larger in size, they have highly colored petals to attract the insects, they have a very good fragment to attract the insects and other animals, and they're highly nectared, usually for the butterflies and for the bat and the other insects. Now we will discuss the next concept of the mechanism of pollination, especially in the water plant called the Vallisneria. So the Vallisneria, they show surface pollination here. So what is a Vallisneria? Vallisneria is a completely submerged plant, completely submerged aquatic plant. There is a separate male plant that produces the small male flower and a female plant that produces the female flower. And the female flower will have a long stalk, and they keep floating on the surface of the water. So what is the Vallisneria? Vallisneria is a completely submerged aquatic plant. So there is separate a male plant and the female plant here. The male plant, they produces a small flower, small male flower, and the female plant will produces the flower which have a long stalk. As a result, the female flower, they keeps floating on the surface of the water. As a male plant matures, the male flower produced or released. When they are released, they shifts to the surface of the water and they keeps on floating. When this male flower comes in contact with the female flower, the anther breaks and releases the pollen grains. So these pollen grains are sticky in nature. Hence, they adhere to the exposed stigma of the female flower, and thus it brings the act of the pollination. After the act of pollination, the stalk of the female flower coils spirally and pulls it down into water. Okay, if you look in the mechanism of the pollination in the Vallisneria, so Vallisneria exhibit surface pollination. So Vallisneria is a completely submerged aquatic plant, and we can find a separate male and a female plant. The male plant, they produces the male flower, small flower. The female plant will produces the flower having a long stalk. As a result, the female flowers always keeps floating on the surface of the water. As the male plant matures, the male flowers are released, and these male flowers they reaches the surface of the water and they keeps on floating. When they comes in contact with the female flower, the anther breaks and releases the pollen grains. These sticky pollen grains, when they adhere to the exposed stigma, they brings the act of the pollinations. Once the pollination begins, the stalk of the female flower coils spirally and it is pulled down into the water. Now, let's study the pollen-pistil interaction. What is pollen-pistil interaction? Pollen-pistil interaction is a series of events from landing of the pollen grain on stigma till the pollen tube enters the ovule. Okay, so pollen-pistil interaction means it is a series of events, a number of steps where we find right from the landing of the pollen grain on stigma up to the pollen tube entering the ovule is said to be pollen-pistil interaction. Here, the stigma is a platform to receive the pollen grain from many sources since it is exposed. Even if a pollen has landed on the stigma, there is no guarantee that it will germinate. The pollen should be of the same species. When the pollen fails to germinate, it is a sign of incompatibility. Therefore, the pollen-pistil interaction may result in either acceptance of the pollen or rejection of the pollen. So what happens if the stigma accepts the pollen? The pollen grain, when lands on the stigma, it absorbs the water from the stigmatic surface. Following this, the pollen tube germinates through germ pore of the exine. So, when the pollen grain lands on the stigmatic surface of the gynoecium, they absorb the water and the pollen tube will come out through the germ pore found on the exine. During the growth of the pollen tube, the generative cell they divide to form two male gametes. Okay, so during the growth of the pollen tube, the generative cell they divide to form two male gametes. The pollen tube now grows through the tissue of stigma, style, reaches the ovary, enters the ovule and comes in contact with the embryo sac. Later, they enters the embryo sac by piercing the synergids through filiform apparatus, and thus the two male gametes are discharged inside the embryo sac. So I will repeat once again. So pollen-pistil interaction means it is a series of events from landing of the pollen grain on stigma till the pollen tube enters the ovule is said to be the pollen-pistil interaction. Here the stigma acts as a platform to receive the pollen grain from many sources. Even if a pollen grain has landed on the stigma, there is no guarantee that it is going to germinate. The pollen should be of the same species. When the pollen grain fails to germinate, it is the sign of the incompatibility. The pollen-pistil interaction may result in either acceptance of the pollen grain or rejection of the pollen grain. Suppose if the stigma accepts the pollen grain, what happens? The pollen grain absorb the water from the stigmatic surface. Following this, the pollen tube germinates through the germ pore of the exine. During the growth of the pollen tube, the generative cell found in the pollen grain will divide to form two male gametes. The pollen tube now grows through the tissue of stigma, style, reaches the ovary, enters the ovule, and comes in contact with the embryo sac. Later, they enters the synergids through filiform apparatus, and the two male gametes are released within the embryo sac. So today in this session we have discussed what is pollination, the types of pollination, the advantage of cross pollination over the self pollination, how to breeding devices, and the agents involved in the pollination, the three types of the flowers based upon the pollinating agent like Nemophilus flower, Hydrophilus flower, Zoophilus flower. We have also discussed the mechanism of the pollination with reference to the Vallisneria, which is an aquatic plant, and we have also discussed about the pollen pistil interaction. Well, in my next class we will discuss about the double fertilization, development of embryo, development of endosperm, about the seed, the fruit, and the special mode of the reproduction in the sexually reproducing flowering plants. Okay, thank you.